What got you involved in such a multidisciplinary approach to philosophy?
Well, partly that must just be a product of my education. When I was an undergraduate at Melbourne, I did pretty much every philosophy subject there was. So I did a double degree back in the early 80s when there was no such thing, and I managed to persuade the arts faculty that they should let me get a BA basically for just doing all the philosophy subjects that there were. And so I had a very, very broad introduction to philosophy and had studied a huge variety of different areas of philosophy before I even got to graduate school. And then I did more coursework at graduate school and covered a whole lot more areas. When I came out of graduate school, I had a bunch of things that I published in different areas out of the things that I'd done up to that point. So that's probably the best answer that I can give to that question. And I have done other things since that were more sort of accidental things I fell into. So I applied for a grant to do a history of philosophy in Australia and New Zealand. And when I got the grant, I had to figure out how to do it. And that's something that if there hadn't been the opportunity to apply for the grant, I probably never would have done that. So some things are in that way just accidental. So I came back from Princeton and was unemployed in Canberra, and where my wife had a job, and they needed somebody to teach philosophy of religion, which I really hadn't paid any attention to up until that point. And they said, "Can you teach philosophy of religion?" And I said yes, and I spent the semester reading the stuff that I was going to teach the next week, so I was about a week ahead of the students. But by the end of the semester, I'd learned quite a lot about philosophy of religion, and I ended up publishing some stuff out of that. Okay, so that's another one of those accidents about how I ended up with all the different things I do. So then I had a couple of contracts, and eventually I had a 3-year contract back in Canberra. So I had a contract in Sydney and a contract for a couple of years in Wollongong. And then I got appointed at Monash. So I've been applying all over the place and couldn't get a job, but eventually I landed one at Monash. So I came here as a lecturer, and by the end of the millennium, I was an associate professor. And when I got made associate professor, I was encouraged to think about leadership. And so I became the head of philosophy in 2000. Did that for a little while and then did various leadership roles in the faculty. I was an associate dean research, associate dean graduate studies. We became a new school. Philosophy was very small. We merged with historical studies and I was the head of the new school. And that came to an end in about 2012 and I haven't had any serious leadership positions since. So the answer to your question is I was head of philosophy once, but that was a long time ago. The other thing that I did do in 2009, I became the CEO of the Australasian Association of Philosophy, and I did that for a decade. So I decided that I'd rather be leading outside the university than inside it.
What position do you hold now?
So I'm a professor, professor of philosophy, and there's nothing else. Oh, well, unless you count being secretary of the cricket club, where I've been secretary for the last 15 years.
Nice. I like cricket. I used to play cricket in the street in Brunswick with my friends from down the road. Yeah, it was good fun. It was a bonding activity between all the different people in all the different cultures. Cricket, of all things, yeah.
Oh, street cricket's great.
Yeah.
I can remember.
I don't think the people who parked their cars near us playing were very appreciative of the extra dents that they got in their cars.
So when I was at uni, I lived in a house on the corner of Faraday Street and Cardigan Street in Carlton, and we used to play street cricket in the intersection there, and we used to wear high-vis vests and safety helmets.
Is there any events in your life or any circumstances, any dynamics in your life that sort of nudged you towards philosophy, or is it just something that you were naturally inclined to enjoy?
So there were probably little things. So I didn't even know what philosophy was until after I became an atheist, which happened when I was about 12 or 13. And then because I liked arguing with people, discussing vigorously with people about religion, including my teachers, I got some recommendations from teachers for things to read, like Pascal's Wager, and I ended up with a copy of Russell's autobiography, which I read a couple of times. I was 15, I was 16 when I read that. And I was very impressed by Russell's account of his own intellectual life and thought, I'd like to be like that. So that's why I ended up doing maths and philosophy when I went to uni, because that's what Russell had done. So that would be, yeah, so I'd sort of knew that I liked philosophy before I left school.
You self-describe as a metaphysical naturalist. Is this accurate? If so, what does it mean, and why do you find this position attractive?
Okay, so it's accurate. I would just describe myself as a naturalist, though. But then that could mean any number of things, so I'm going to have to explain what it means. So basically what it means is that I think that natural reality is all of reality. That will be one short way of saying it. There are only natural objects, and the only things with causal powers and natural objects with natural causal powers. So this rules out lots of things, and the way to work out what there is really has two parts to it. One part of it is where there's kind of universal common sense consensus, there are those things, stars and trees and so on. And then where there's expert scientific consensus, there are those things, molecules, DNA and stuff that we wouldn't have gotten without science. But those are the two things that tell you what there is. Anything that doesn't fall into one of those categories just isn't, if I can put it like that.
Now, you call yourself a moral realist. I lean that way too. Would you go far as calling yourself a moral naturalist?
Probably not.
Like Peter Railton, for
instance. Probably not, because the way that people use the expression moral naturalism, though maybe this isn't going to pick out Railton exactly, they kind of think that you can reduce moral talk to talk couched in the vocabulary of the natural sciences. And I certainly don't think that you can do that. I think that, I guess the person that one of the people that I follow here is Fodor, who thought that the special sciences were autonomous, so you can't reduce chemistry to physics. We couldn't do chemistry if the only language we had was the language of atomic physics, right? And I think that there's a similar kind of irreducibility to the moral talk. And so that probably rules me out from counting as a moral naturalist. On the other hand, I'm a naturalist and I believe that there are moral truths. It's just that I think that what moral truths there are necessary truths. They couldn't be otherwise. So there isn't anything that makes them true, necessary. So it's just like my attitude towards mathematics. I don't think that there are numbers laid up in Platonic heaven. I don't think that there are abstract objects at all. But I certainly think that there are numerical truths, right? And so the story is going to be that you can have, as some people put it, objectivity in mathematics, but without the objects. And I want to take that move and apply it in morality as well, so that there are moral truths, but there's no moral stuff that makes those moral truths true. So there are truths about fairness, for example, about what's fair, but there isn't anything in the world you can point to and say that's the stuff that makes those claims about fairness true.
Do you think that there's much power to Hume's razor, the is-ought divide?
So it's consistent with what I was just saying, that I think that there's a serious divide there. You can't reduce the ought claims to is claims. I think there's something in that. I should have prefaced all of this by saying that this whole area is immensely difficult, and I'm not particularly confident in the views that I hold. But I do think, now that you've mentioned that, that is worth saying that I do think that you can't reduce the normative to the non-normative. You can't reduce the evaluative to the non-evaluative. And if that's what the people that you're referring to as ethical naturalists are trying to do, then I'm not with them on that.
There's a worry that I have that no matter how much evidence you get from the world, like, the evidence of suffering in factory farms or unessential suffering out there, and evidence for it, now one can't derive from that any nudging or any influence to moral decision-making. I think that's probably going a bit too far, isn't it? Can't real facts about the world inform our moral decisions?
So maybe we should think about psychopaths for a bit.
Ted Bundy.
It's perfectly possible for people to actually get a kick out of that suffering and nothing else. So there's no easy route from just sort of observing the suffering and having an appropriate response to it, I don't think.
Okay, well, let's talk about making arguments and dealing with disagreement. What do you think makes for a good argument?
So I have a very controversial view about this. And so you should take this with a big grain of salt. So here's my kind of ideal good argument. You're committed to a bunch of propositions, and I point out to you that from the things that you're committed to, this other thing follows, and you haven't noticed this yet. Now, this has the makings of a good argument, right?
All sorts of hidden premises.
So in particular, if the thing that follows is absurd, then I've pointed out to you that you've got some work to do to kind of restore the health of your belief system. But even if it's something that's not absurd, you might still look at it and think, no, I don't think that's right. And so it gives you a reason to revise your other beliefs. So I think everybody should agree that's a good use for arguments. It may not be the first thing that comes to mind, but it's something that should come to mind. So I'm thinking about arguments as a set of premises and a conclusion here. I'll say something else about good arguing in a minute, right? But about good arguments. I don't think there are any other kinds of good arguments. That's it. It's the last bit that's controversial, not the first bit, right? So in particular, lots of people have this view that that if you want to make someone change their mind, you should give them an argument that has as its conclusion the thing that you want them to accept, and that has as its premises things that, well, what? That you find plausible. Well, that's hardly ever going to be a useful thing to do, because if the person doesn't accept your conclusion, odds are very high that they're not going to accept one or more of your premises unless there's something that's gone awry, in which case they'll fall back into the earlier case, right? Their beliefs will entail something contradictory or absurd. So that kind of argument is never going to be an effective move to make. Okay, so that's part of the view. The other thing is this. We're thinking of arguments as a certain kind of abstract object, set of premises and a conclusion. So it's basically a list of propositions, but one of them is distinguished. There's another abstract object, namely a theory, which is a set of propositions, with the further condition that it's closed under logical consequence. So anything that's a consequence of what's in the theory is in the theory. Now, our beliefs are not like that. Beliefs are not closed under logical consequence. And as I've already suggested, sometimes you're unaware of the consequences of what you believe. But your commitments are. You're committed to what follows. That's why when I say to you, look, absurdity follows, you think, I've got to change, I've got to change what I've got here. I don't want to be committed to what's absurd. I think that the right thing to think about here is that theory is much more important than argument. In fact, which arguments are sound, which ones a valid, I mean, amongst the valid arguments, which ones are sound, which ones you think are sound, is determined by your theory, which claims you think are true. Right, so we can kind of we can derive what arguments you're going to think are sound from your theory, and you can't work in the reverse direction, right? There's far too many of the arguments, and in any case, we're not capable of, amassing the arguments and doing that kind of stuff. So philosophers have forever have said you need arguments, but that's not true. What you need is good theories, I think. So I have a view about the nature of philosophy that's at odds with kind of what lots of mainstream people have said. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's it. End of rant.
Okay. Well, it seems that a lot of what wins an argument is rhetoric and the appearance of confidence and, getting people to believe things by hiding premises and all those sorts of things, just to get it across the line so you can get them on your side. But that doesn't seem like a very honest and humble way to go about arguing. What's the role of epistemic humility in good theory production or good argumentation? Okay,
so let's go back to just thinking about arguing for a bit. When we're in conversation one-on-one, we can argue cooperatively. And what I've got in mind is a bit like we can discuss cooperatively. So Grice had this theory about conversation. He thought that there were various maxims that, although you could play with them in order to advance the goals of the conversation, if you were cooperating, you'd almost all the time be conforming to these maxims. So you would only say relevant things, for example. So there's maxims of quantity, quality, relevance, and something else. So you wouldn't talk too much. You'd make sure the other person has an opportunity to speak. You wouldn't deliberately say things that you didn't believe, and so on. There's a bunch of things you wouldn't do. And the same is true for arguing. There's a similar bunch of things. I think that if you put forward an argument understood as a set of premises and a conclusion, in the ordinary understanding, you're asserting the premises, and so they're subject to the Gricean norms of conversation. If we're having a cooperative conversation, we can argue cooperatively, but we'll be giving each other arguments of the kind that I mentioned at the beginning, because it's advantageous to at least one of us, in that we'll be able to improve our position if if other people point out the things we haven't noticed about our own theories. Okay, so that's by way of, so good arguing I think will be cooperative, but lots of arguing is not cooperative. Lots of the time people argue because they want to win, they want to show the other person stupid. There's a whole lot of reasons and a whole lot of outcomes that you might want when you argue. I don't think that the primary purpose of arguing is to persuade, for example, not cooperative arguing. The purpose is to improve everybody's view. That's what the real purpose of arguing is, according to me. But lots of people argue because they want to get other people to accept claims that they already accept. And in my view, that's, while it's still arguing, it's not the kind of arguing that we ought to engage in. Okay. Now, I'll mention one more kind of question that comes up at this point. Often people think of orators as arguing, but there's a question about the extent to which cooperative arguing can scale up. Right? If we're talking one-on-one, I can get to know what you think, and that puts me in a position to be able to help you by saying, but look, you believe these things and they entail this absurdity or whatever. If I'm talking to a crowd of thousands of people, I don't get to know any of the people out there. And so it's not clear that I really can be thought of as arguing cooperatively with them. And so, the old philosophical opposition to rhetoric that you find amongst certain kinds of philosophers maybe has something to it. because rhetoric, the art of rhetoric was primarily about persuading big groups of people through your oratorial skill. And I mean, while I'm not saying there is no kind of role for that, I don't think you should think of it as arguing.
Right, yes. And on that point, one of the most well-known theological debaters living today is William Lane Craig, which I just found out recently said something along the lines that he thinks that you're one of the most intellectually honest atheists that he's come across. Now, you've obviously parlayed with him.
Well, a few times. We've had, so I've had lunch with him a couple of times. One time I had lunch with Craig and Richard Swinburne. That was a really interesting lunch. But yes, we have that. One time we did a talk about the effectiveness of mathematics that's on YouTube.
Okay.
Yeah.
So people find it difficult to unseat cherished beliefs, even though they've been sort of given good arguments to the contrary. What should it take for us to actually change our minds?
So that's a good question. And you can change your mind because you're talking to somebody who's an expert and they tell you stuff. And that's perfectly reasonable. My own view is that in the areas where there's expert scientific consensus, if you're not coordinating your belief to the expert consensus, you're not doing as well as you could vis-a-vis believing, right? So that's one way of, I mean, there are limitations to this because that way you get sort of information about what's settled in science, what everybody knows is already settled. If you want to go beyond that, maybe if there's some area that you particularly care about, you need to train in it. You need to just make yourself into an expert and then do what you can to push ahead in that area. It's very slow going, hard work and all that.
It's interesting that a lot of what looks like overconfidence, which might just be confidence mixed with enthusiasm that comes from when you're a relative neophyte in an area and you just watch a YouTube video and think you know enough to prove wrong a whole epistemic community of scientists on a given topic, right? What's going on?
Right. So I think it's useful to distinguish different domains here. So in scientific domains, as I already said, you're not coordinating your belief to where there's expert consensus, right? Something's going wrong. But there are whole areas, and philosophy is one of them, where there's no expert consensus. Philosophers don't agree about anything. There's nothing, right? And religion, and I'm talking globally, so I mean that there's a global consensus. Right, if it's a problem in Newtonian mechanics, it's not like there are physicists who disagree about the answer, right? There's some equations, you solve them, you get an answer. They all agree which equations they are, they all get the same answer. Ask people some question about religion and you get very different answers in Melbourne, Islamabad, Delhi, Peru. Right, sorry, I swapped from cities to countries, but anyway, you know, and so on. There just isn't expert consensus there. And so if you've watched a few YouTube videos about religion, it probably makes no difference one way or the other to your how good the content that you put out is going to be, whereas it makes all the difference in the world if you're talking about biology. If you just haven't done the science.
On the subject of changing minds, has there been any beliefs which you once held close to your heart, which you've had to let go of in light of new evidence or better reasoning?
So, close to my heart, things that I at one point kind of believed and kind of identified with. There have been plenty. I don't know whether I would feel like it was hard to let go of them though, because I only gave them up because I came to believe something else. Mm. Right. So So early in my career, I was definitely a reductive physicalist. I thought that by far the most economical worldview was going to be one in which everything just reduced to physics. And it's hard to say exactly how I gave that up, but I've certainly reached a point where I don't believe that anymore, as we discussed earlier on.
Who are the people in the pictures behind you?
Okay, so on this side is Camo Jackson, who was one of the foundation professors of philosophy at Monash and father of Frank Jackson. On the other side is Hector Monroe, the other of the foundation professors at Monash, and most famous for writing a book of sonnets about famous philosophers. Very amusing.